You're listening to Tales from the Ridge. Episode 6, Miss Oda Regrets. Emily woke slowly, the warm fuzz of sleep still weighing down her limbs. She rolled to one side, stretching out an arm only to find an empty space where her lover had been. The sleepiness suddenly vanished, and she sat up in bed with a start. A slight panicked noise left her throat as she threw back the sheets as if he might have been hiding beneath them. He promised, she said over and over again to herself as she stumbled from the bed, picking up pieces of her littered clothing and bundling them in her arms. Madame Bovery's brothel was already alive despite the early hour. She could hear the other girls conversing and preparing for the day. A knock interrupted her panicked thoughts, and Emily moved quickly to the door. "Good morning, sugar. I was just..." Boss Red Cloud stopped her salutations as she caught the expression on Emily's face. "Emily?" She stepped into the room and closed the door. "What's wrong, honey? You look like somebody kicked your dog." "He's gone," Emily whimpered, sinking onto the floor, pressing her face into her hands. "He promised he would take me this time." Emily could hear Boss's deep sigh through the veil of her sobs. "Did you let that Jim Connor into your bed again?" Emily nodded, and the keen of her crying heightened in intensity. Boss sat down beside her, the satin of her nightgown brushing softly against Emily's leg. "What did you go and do that for?" Boss asked gently. "You know he ain't nothing but a liar." "I love him." Boss set one warm hand upon Emily's knees. "He doesn't deserve you." Emily scoffed. "Doesn't deserve a whore? What man on earth doesn't deserve that?" "Plenty," Boss said back sternly. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up before the madame sees you blubbering over a John who doesn't pay." Boss drew a bath in the tub that adjoined both her and Emily's suite. Emily dragged herself into the bathroom, waiting on the cool tile as steam filled the room. She could see through the open door that Cash Guthrie was still asleep in Boss's bed, her black braids splayed over the pillows as she snored softly. Boss shut the door with a quiet click. "How come you don't kick her out before the morning?" Emily asked after wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Boss's lips twitched up into a small smile as she helped Emily into the tub. "She's special." "I thought Jim was special," Emily sighed as she descended into the warm water. "I know, darling." Time passed slowly as Boss stepped out of the room, and the warm water relaxed Emily's aching muscles. Finally, she felt the desire to move, lifting a bright pink bar of soap to lather all over her body. Her eyes followed the odd scratches and bruises that her patrons had left over her in the course of the week. They drew no emotion, and yet Jim's lies stung more than a hand ever could. After rinsing her hair, Emily stood from the bath and padded over to a fluffy towel hooked upon the door. She wrapped herself in its embrace and set to cleaning up her quarters, tidying the sheets, picking up empty glassware and setting it to be collected out in the hallway, putting dirty clothes in her hamper. The lamp of fairy dust, a gaseous light source native to her home planet, was glowing orange to match the clean morning light streaming in through the windows. Emily stared at it for a long time, thinking of the path that led her here to Al-Sufi and the grimy metropolis of Leadbelly. A tiny spark of anger lit in her guts its rudeness evaporating the self-pity that had clouded the morning. She stomped to her armoire and dug inside, withdrawing what she knew for a fact was Jim's favorite gown. It was a deep red velvet with draping folds that accented her hips. She slipped it on over her underthings and then strode to the bedside table, where she threw open the drawer and pulled out the small shock pistol stored there. Emily shoved the weapon into the deep pockets of the dress and sat down at her vanity, brushing on her makeup with determined fingers. Emily sang as she worked, moving rouge over each cheek, her warm alto voice filling the small space of her room and pushing out some of the darker shadows. When she had finished her work, she stood, taking her purse and striding confidently from Madame Bovery's brothel. Out on the street, her attire drew more than a bit of attention. Though ostentatious displays were hardly uncommon in Lead Belly, a working woman in a night at the opera attire this early in the morning was something to hoot at, apparently. Emily minded it not a bit. Her thoughts had a singular focus. The sparkling sign of her favorite cafe dazzled her as she sat down on the patio, picking out her favorite spot where she could see the baristas and workers bustling about like bees in a hive. "Hello, Miss Oda," said the familiar voice of the Therian server who frequently worked the opening shift. "Your usual?" "Yes, please," said Emily with a warm smile. The foaming tea, pale purple in color, arrived with an almond croissant flavored artificially. Of course, who could afford almonds on a desert planet? Emily sipped the brew and gave a soft sigh, letting the tea float her mind away as she leaned back on the metal of the chair beneath her. After a few moments, she peeked one eye open and lifted the pastry to her lips, savoring every bite. Her breakfast complete, Emily stood, leaving a generous tip behind. She took to the streets once again, her mind puzzling over her current desires. "Where might you be, Jim Connor?" she said to herself out loud. Emily forced herself to think back on the night before, ignoring the bubbling feelings of love and comfort that mixed uneasily with regret and resentment. Jim had talked about leaving Alsafi for good, but to do what? Emily's kitten heels clicked against the pavement as the residents of Leadbelly scooted around her. He had talked about a new farming initiative, some planet giving away land to anyone who promised to tend it. What was the name of the ship he had booked passage on? The Tarantella. The pace of her walking increased by a clip as she turned toward the barge yard. It was a long way to walk from her current location. With a high whistle, she called down a motor carriage that slowed its rumble as it approached her. "Need a ride, miss?" asked the driver as he rolled down the window. "How much to get to the barge yard?" Emily asked. 5 chips. Reasonable. "Let's go then, sweet cheeks," said Emily with a smile that held only an edge of cunning. She climbed through the door as it swung up slowly into the air. The seats inside were well-abused leather, their scent mixing with the perfumey air freshener swinging from a hook on the window. "How long have you been driving?" Emily asked as the vehicle lumbered forward in motion. "Too many years to count," said the driver with a gruff laugh. "Bet you see a lot of interesting things out here." The driver's eyes flashed up into the rearview mirror to glance at her as he replied, "You bet I do." "I don't know a single person that hasn't seen some shit on Alsafi, though," Emily laughed brightly. The driver agreed with a low chuckle. Neon lights refracted through the window beside her as they picked up speed. The driver maneuvered his large, clumsy vehicle with a masterful hand, zipping through the narrow streets of the galaxy's city of vice. Emily took in the sights. They no longer awed her, but the towers of metal and glass that sprouted up amongst older, more sturdy-looking buildings created an odd visual roller coaster for the eyes. "You got something on your mind, miss?" the driver asked carefully. "You've got a faraway look." Emily's brow drew together in surprise. "You usually interrogate your customers?" She could see the blush that rose on the tips of his cheeks in the mirror. "Not usually, no, but something about your demeanor compels me." Emily shook her curled red hair and lowered her eyes. "The smooth-talkingest man in the galaxy has wronged me," Emily said wistfully. "Not for the first time, but hopefully the last." "Is that why you're headed to the barge yard?" asked the driver. "You getting off this rock?" Emily smiled softly. "Something like that." "All due respect, he must be an idiot," the driver said as casually as he could muster. "Double-crossing a woman like you." Emily's laughter held a pinch of cruelty. Women like me don't get much better than that, darling. He blushed again and was silent. As they pulled up to the barge yard, the driver hesitated in opening the door. You ain't gonna keep me prisoner now, are you? Emily asked in irritation. No, ma'am, I just wanted to say good luck is all. Emily's expression softened. I hope you get off this rock too, she said softly, leaning forward in the seat to give the driver a peck on the cheek before she darted from the motor. Emily did not glance behind her as the carriage idled for a moment, and then began its journey back toward the center of town. For a moment, the gentle kindness of the driver made her pause. She thought about running after him, waving him down and telling him to take her home. But then she thought about the promises Jim had whispered into the nook of her neck last night, and steeled her resolve. The barge yard was loud. Further away, she could see the spaceships taking off, their gigantic engines glowing in volcanic red shapes as they picked up speed. Here at the entrance, a few hotels, saloons, and dance halls were all to service the workers who came and went from the docks in a steady stream. If I was Jim Connor, where would I be? Where would I be? Where would I be? Emily sang to herself, stifling an uncomfortable giggle that rose in her throat. She resolved to begin with sussing out where the Tarantella had made harbor. In her current regalia, it was not a difficult task to flag down the nearest spacer and get directions. The man blinked rapidly and stumbled through his words, his eyes barely managing to stay centered on her face. Emily thanked him and moved deeper into the barge yard. Although it was still mid-morning, the size of the ships around her blocked out so much light that the strings of bulbs that lit this part of the yard remained on, their incandescent light glittering off gleaming hulls, scarred by multiple entries and exits through the atmosphere. The Tarantella was not half as majestic as Jim had described it, though that came as no surprise. It was significantly smaller than the frigates around it and centuries older. Emily was almost grateful she would not be putting her life in its interstellar hands. As if summoned by this realization, Jim Connor stood at the base of its gangplank, welding something to the side of the ship. In the loud, bright work, he did not notice her approach. She stood there behind him, her hand deep in the pocket of her red velvet gown, tracing the end of her shock pistol. The welding stopped, and he lifted the visor to his helmet. Jim? The man jolted in surprise, standing so quickly the torch in his hand nearly dropped. Emily! Leaving without me? She asked with a bright smile. No, honey, I just had some work that needed to be done, and then I was coming right back, I swear to God. Emily sighed. Her eyes drifted slowly to her feet, and then back up to Jim's face. Fool me once, Jim Connor. Shame on you. She drew her gun. Fool me twice. She shot him. The gun jolted violently against her hand, the smell of its electric discharge stinging her nostrils. She watched as a red pool of blood grew from a small circle to a jagged oval across the surface of his shirt. Shouts rose up from the other ships and barges as men came to see what the fuss was about. Time had slowed to a crawl for her, and Emily hardly noticed as she dropped her arm, letting the shock pistol fall to the ground beside her. Rough hands took hold of her and began to pull her away from Jim as he sank to his knees, his eyes blurring and fading as they held her gaze. Emily could feel her feet being dragged beneath her, heels chipping against the dock. In her shock-drunk stupor, she mumbled, Tell boss Red Cloud, Miss Oda regrets. She's unable to lunch today. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Tales from the Ridge. To support this project and others, find me on Patreon, R.E. Levy Author. A shout out to all my patrons, Mist, Claire, Susasaurus, Matthew, Taysom, Vicky, Michael, Willow, Jill, Orsoya, Jessica, Frenchon, Chelsea, Fritz, Rodney, Andrew, Megan, Kira, Katie, Camille, Emily, Andy, and Kat. If you liked this episode, give me a shout out on social media. You can find me at Ari Levy or Ari Levy Author on any social media. And most of all, thanks for listening.